As countries prepare to unveil new commitments to reducing carbon emissions during COP26, electric companies are also announcing their own net zero targets and reaffirming their support of global climate initiatives. On this Earth Day, as world leaders convene at a climate summit hosted by the Biden administration, we look forward to discussing the policies and financial tools needed to achieve net zero, as well as the importance of collaboration between the public and private sector to fully realize net zero targets. This panel features Bill Brown of 8 Rivers Capital, Andrew Steer of the Bezos Earth Fund, Soren Andreasen of EDFI, Pat Vincent Kalan of PNM Resources, and former President of Iceland, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson. The session will be moderated by EEI Vice President for International Programs, Dr. Lawrence Jones. Without further ado, please welcome the panel to the stage for our next session, Realizing Net Zero Ambitions, Policy and Finance.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Nice to see all of you.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Great. So first of all, it's a delight. I've been looking forward to this panel. We've had multiple panels, several panels at the Jeff, but I must tell you, none has made me more nervous than this one, and primarily because of the esteemed speakers who I have met over the years, and many I know who know how to throw questions back to a moderator. So I have my work cut out for me here today. So let's jump straight into it. First of all, like Vanessa said, there's President Biden is having his Earth Summit today. We know that no one person, no one company, no one philanthropy can help us to deal with the global challenge we're facing today. So what we're going to do is have a conversation where we're going to try to cover a range of issues. We'll talk about Earth Day very briefly. Net zero, we'll get into geopolitics, which is why I invited former President Grimsson to be here with us. Finance, philanthropy, how we scale up things, get into some of the issues around values, and then big picture, big discussion about the predictions going forward. We know that Earth Day started in 1970. It was a bipartisan agreement between a Republican and a Democrat in America. It went global in 1990, and there's been a lot has happened since then. So let's kick it off, and I'll start with you, former President Grimsson. Can you just tell us how has having an Earth Day made a difference for the world?
It's very difficult to answer that question because in big parts of the world, Earth Day doesn't really play any role for a number of reasons. But I think for us, especially in the Western world, Earth Day has served as a reminder. And now when we are hopefully moving into a new era with the leadership of the United States, China, the European Union, and almost every country in the world acknowledging the need for a global coalition in our climate battle, the Earth Day is a handy heritage for us to come together. That gives, for example, the summit that President Biden is now convening an extra dimension because it builds on the legacy of the Earth Day in previous decades, but it also sends a very modern symbol. But we have to remember, as we come together for this discussion, that there are over 1 billion people in the world that don't really have any access to electricity as we know it in the advanced world. And the challenge for the hundreds of millions and a few billions of people who live in highly polluted cities in Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world is very difficult to interpret to them. The significance of Earth Day. They want to be able to breathe. So a breathe day would perhaps be more appropriate for the suffering billions of people. And let's not forget that although the pandemic is a tragic phenomena, every year more than twice the number of people that have already died from the COVID pandemic die every year, 7 million people from urban pollution. So the challenge of Earth Day, the climate action, clean energy, and health all come together in this way. But I think the value of the Earth Day is primary. It has established over the decades, established a legacy, and is therefore an important tool to use in the battle ahead.
Thank you. Let's go to Soren. What's your view? Why is Earth Day important from your perspective?
Well, I think my personal view is that Earth Day will be most important for the Earth Days that we remember, because they set the stage for important decisions to go forward towards our goal of aligning with the Paris Agreement. And I very much hope that today will be one of those days, or the summit that we will see this today and tomorrow will be one of those days.
And Pat, what about you? What's your take?
Well, Lawrence, it's going to be hard to top the story that you had in this morning's sessions about the birth of your daughter. So unfair to ask, but I think, to me, the key thing about Earth Day is it helps raise awareness of individual actions that we can all take to make this planet a better place. And so, for example, we have our employees out picking up plastic and things like that. And it really tells all of us that we have a part to play in cleaning up our planet.
Thank you. Thanks, Pat. Bill, what about you? Bill, you're on mute.
Earth Day is the beginning of the environmental movement. It started in 1970. It really is a way of commemorating how far we've come, yet how far we have to go. And I agree in many respects with everything that people before me have said, is that this is about milestones, this is about purpose, this is about intent, and it's about education.
Thank you. So, Andrew, I saved you for the last because we're so happy you can join us. This is perhaps your first public event in your new role as president and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. So in addition to telling us why Earth Day is important, maybe you can just take a few minutes and just tell us about this very huge obligation and responsibility you have now as running this new thing called the Bezos Earth Fund.
Well, first, Lawrence, congratulations to you and EEI for this amazing conference you've put on, and what an important subject. Look, of course, as Bill says, Earth Day brings citizens' voices. 1970, the first Earth Day led to the EPA, led to the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, whole range of issues. Governments rarely lead. Governments rightly represent people. And if we're going to address climate change, for example, we need hearts and minds as well as sharp pencils and government officials. And today was an amazing day. I don't know whether we're going to talk later about the US commitment, but my goodness me, demonstrates what leadership actually is. 50%, 52% reduction by 2020, and others are following. Look at Canada, look at Japan, remarkable. And of course, part of this amazing adventure we're on is precisely that, I have the privilege of helping to manage an amazing gift by, a great corporate leader, Jeff Bezos, $10 billion. Why? Well, because he sees this is the decisive decade. This is the decade when the economy of the world is going to shift in an amazingly exciting way. Now, it could shift in a bad way, by the way, or it could stay as it is now, which would be a disaster. But done right, it's going to shift in a very exciting way. As President Biden said this morning, more jobs, better jobs, healthier people, greener fields, better societies, fairer distribution of income, and so on. And so that's what we're involved in the Bezos Earth Fund. We will be allocating this $10 billion during this decade, and we'll be looking for opportunities that will really make a difference. And I'd love to talk about it more, but I've gone on too long.
No, well, we'll get back to that. So let's talk about the net zero momentum. And I want to go to Pat on this. And because, Pat, she was a former chair of EEI, and she understands the idea of grabbing momentum. She did a lot of work there when she was chair to do things like diversity and equity and inclusion to build momentum. So, Pat, do you think we have enough momentum to avoid going back to what we've come from, or is this now an irreversible track of moving forward?
Lawrence, I'm optimistic that this is an irreversible track moving forward. If you think about it, you've got individuals pushing this. You've got the politicians on board for the most part, and you've got companies leading the way. Economics are on our side if you look at the prices of renewable energy. And so I think that we're there. And I think that the younger generation is going to continue to make sure that we do not backslide on this. And I know we'll get into it later, but the financial incentives are lining up now. The policy incentives are going to start to line up. And when customer preferences line up, you have three really powerful dynamics that I don't think will allow us to go backwards. Will there be a little bit of an occasional backslip and forth? Yes. Do we need to get some more folks in the world on board? Yes. But I think with President Biden getting the U.S. back into the game and showing leadership, the electric power industry, as Tom has said, has been leading the way in this country. Now we start getting the transportation and the industrial and the agriculture sectors on board. I'm more optimistic than I have ever been in my career that we are ready to get to net zero.
And so, Soren, from the financial perspective, we did just listen to Alan Schwartz, and he's convinced that there's no reversal going there. You're in the sort of a development finance sector. Do you see the same momentum, no more reversal, moving straight ahead?
Well, I think finance is a good example of a sector where it's really important to start with the end in mind. And I think net zero is an incredibly compelling end to have in mind. And a lot of finance is really long term. A lot of the finance that's going to lead us through the transition to the low carbon economy is very long term. We are talking decades for many financial commitments. And so having a goal that stretches beyond the investment horizon for the finance that's really the private finance and public finance that's really going to make this happen is incredibly important. And I think in that way, net zero is a dramatically important way of framing it. I do think for investors as well as policymakers, there's an awful lot of technical questions about how we get there that we still don't fully know the answer to. But that's why we are getting to work.
Well, thank you. We're going to come back to policy and finance. We're going to spend a lot of time on those two topics. But I want to now move to geopolitics. President Grimson, you alluded to the billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity. You led the commission that did some work on the geopolitics of the energy transition. Can you just tell us what were some of the key findings that came from that study?
Well, it was a very interesting exercise. It was launched 4 years ago by the departing Director General of IRENA. And the task was to map out if and how the geopolitical world was changing away from oil and fossil fuel over to clean energy. And we got together some of the remarkable leaders of the energy sector, international institutions, oil states, as well as others. It was a very diverse group of people. And it was not given at all that we would reach an agreement, because what we found at the first meeting in Berlin was that the academic community, the expert community, had not really paid any attention to this. To this question. So the literature was very meager, in fact. So the Commission had to rely on its common experience and common wisdom. And what we found out in the beginning, to our surprise, I must say, was that in the previous 10 years, and that's the good news, in the previous 10 years, there had been an extraordinary transformation in the area of clean energy, renewable energy. Through technological innovation in solar, wind, urban traffic, biomass, geothermal, clean energy was now cost competitive to the fossil fuel. It made a greater business sense to invest in clean energy for companies and cities and countries than to rely on fossil fuel. And I think that all of us, even if we thought we were pretty knowledgeable about this sector, were surprised by the pace of this transformation. That's the fundamental good news. And then we mapped out what will be the consequences of this. And that is also a series of good news, because the technological nature of clean energy is such that it empowers villages, cities, districts, regions to become energy independent. The technology of clean energy is now that each and every one of us can decide to become an energy player. The big economy of oil companies and huge corporations in the energy sector is basically over and is fast fading from the scene. So the first major geopolitical consequences is to use oil and fossil fuel as a political tool is disappearing very fast. And that means the influence of states that have gained power through their rich natural resources in this area will no longer be as predominant in the 21st century. And so democratization of energy, energy independent, the diversification of energy is all happening much faster. And we name a number of countries all over the world that illustrate this. But also, which I think surprised us, because of the leadership that China has taken in the last 10 years in the clean energy sector, being through their technological innovation and the scale of their investment, the most cost-effective source to go to for wind energy, solar energy, urban cars and electric cars and so on, has created a new pillar, the clean energy, geopolitical, renewable energy pillar under the China leadership. And what I find fascinating about the Biden administration vis-a-vis China is that despite all this talk about conflict and tension between the US and China, we are now seeing an emergence of a race between the US and China in the field of clean energy. That both of them, US under the Biden administration, want to excel, want to be the global clean energy leader. And as we all know, climate battle is all about energy. That's really what it is about. So the report, I think, carries a very optimistic message that, first of all, it can be done. It's already happening. It takes less time than we thought, perhaps sort of 10 years ago. And the geopolitical consequences will, most of them, be very positive. We will reduce conflict, reduce wars, and create a more equal and more harmonious global society. I know it sounds sort of idealistic, in a way too good to be true, but I can assure you there were hard-headed people in the commission. And I think the surprise was that after 2 years of deliberation, we all came to this common conclusion.
Well, thank you. And I want to just add one thing you said regarding resources. One of the beauties here is that when the wind blows on the West Coast, it's the same wind you're going to feel on the East Coast. So the wind doesn't change when it's blowing, right? The same wind that blows in China will blow in Singapore. And that's the beauty of renewable resources. The wind just keeps blowing and the sun keeps shining. Just to stay quickly on the issue of geopolitics, I want to go back to you, Andrew. You've worked all over the world. Do you share the same optimism? I mean, we just saw an agreement between the U.S. and China on cooperation around clean energy. Do you think this bodes well for the rest of the world? And then I want to come back and start getting to the finance and policy side, starting with Pat and then going back to Bill. So just quickly, geopolitics. Do you share the same optimism as President Grimson?
Yes, I think President Grimson expressed it brilliantly, and the report he led is also very important. Look, this is totally unstoppable. And what we do need are partnerships on technology. And today also Prime Minister Modi announced that there was a technology partnership also with the United States, and it's a very healthy race, and we're driving down costs every single year. And the United States now realizes it doesn't make any sense for China to have 96% of all the electric buses in the world. Actually, building electric buses is something you can become good at in the United States. And so there is now a program that an organization that I led until last week, and you're on the board of, Lawrence, the World Resource Institute, is helping to electrify the 480,000 school buses in the United States. Now, that not only reduces carbon, it also introduces a generation of children to clean air. And by the way, air inside school buses, especially in poor counties, is really rotten and unhealthy. They'll have clean air, they'll have curriculum linked to these new buses, and the United States will develop the capacity to build electric buses. That's just one out of 1,000 stories of how this exciting race is going to continue.
It's a good race. Bill, let me come to you before I go to Pat. Talking about geopolitics, just talking about technology quickly. What's your view on the whole idea of the geopolitics of these different technologies, whether it's carbon capture utilization or is solar, wind? What's your view? I know we talked about the issue of rare earth metals and all that stuff. What's your view? And then I want to go to Pat to talk about public policy. You first.
Yeah, I agree with what many of the others have said thus far, is that we're starting to get to the point where economics can drive and rather than policy. And I do think that economics do have to drive. We do have to get out of the way at this point in many respects and encourage it. But one of the things that we've noticed is we focused at one of our companies a lot on innovation of new technology. And we realized it took 10 years to innovate something new. And we also realized that in order to get to net zero by 2050, the world has to spend $50 trillion to get there. That's $5 billion a day, every day for 30 years. The only way the world is going to spend $5 billion a day, every day for 30 years is if it makes economic sense. And at the same time, it's only going to do it if it's more decentralized. Now, along those lines, I harken back to 1990 when you had Sears was the best and biggest mail order retailer in the world, and IBM was the biggest computer company in the world. Yet neither one of them could see that they had to break down their own silos to create a company called Amazon. Amazon was not a technology innovation. Amazon was a business innovation. And I think that in order to get to net zero by 2050, we need to help people get out of the way so that we can break down these silos, so we can allow a power plant to produce electricity and hydrogen, or a hydrogen plant to do direct air capture. Or we need to break down these silos and create the Amazons of the physical world, not just the marketing world.
So one of the key words we've used to set this whole conference up was convergence. And Pat, I know working in the power industry, policy and regulation is very important. So we've now heard the big announcements being made by President Biden and all the world leaders. But how do we achieve policy convergence between the federal and the state level in the U.S., for example? Then we'll go to Soren to talk about the European Union and how we achieve convergence there. But Andrew talked about transportation electrification, for example, something I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about. How do you harmonize and find convergence between the public policy at the state level and at the federal level? Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I think, and unlike Bill, I prefer economics over policy. Economics is long lasting, and policy ebbs and flows depending upon the administrations that you get. But I think on this one, Lawrence, the federal government really needs to take the lead and set whether or not it's a clean energy standard that we have here, whether or not it's a carbon tax. I know some people hate that word, but if you set that kind of framework, then the states can work within it. And I know we've always said in our industry, if you just give us the rules of the road, we'll do very well. And so I think having the federal government set that, and then having the state regulatory bodies have some guidance from the feds. One of the things that you've asked about is we have very long-lived assets in our business, but we need to start depreciating them quicker. We have a transmission line here in New Mexico, 10 years, and it hasn't gotten built. And it was one of President Obama's fast tracks. Think of all the time we waste if we're trying to export clean energy. So I think it's having the federal government set a framework where the states can then sort of find their pieces in here. Unfortunately, there are some pollutants that are local, but most of them are either regional or, in the case of greenhouse gases, international. So we've got to have the Fed set the line there for us.
Soren, what about you from the European Union, where you have 27 odd countries doing their own thing, but then they all have to converge around Brussels? How do they get harmonization there? And by the way, including Brexit, by the way.
Yeah, well, but I think the fact that the EU has been able to, in a sense, set the pace for some of the commitments around reducing emissions over time and so on, it has to do with some decisions that were not just made the last few years, but that were actually made decades ago to look at sector regulation, especially maybe power sector regulation, but also other sectors, allowing the private sector to come in and contribute and invest. And introduce very important policies like feed-in tariffs for renewables, which really help stand up the industry, and allowing auctions to allow renewables projects of larger and larger scale to emerge. So the economy really saw the sector emerge alongside the commitments, and of course policy was a driver all the way along. But I think the fact that industry and investors have been let in to this has helped speed things up and build confidence over time.
So I want to stay on the policy, two other aspects there before we move over to finance. Andrew, I think Pat alluded to something around carbon pricing, what she mentioned is somewhat, and Alan Schwartz brought up about a credit market for that as well. So here's the big thing that I want to discuss it right now, and I'd like to get your view on it, Andrew, before we move over to President Grimson. Carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's a word that we keep hearing. That's a phrase we keep hearing. Is it feasible? Is it going to work? How do we make it work? Do you see in the future such a thing?
Well, it's very interesting. If you read the United States NDC, its commitment that was issued today, in the very beginning of that, it mentions carbon border adjustments. Very interesting. I mean, a strong political statement saying, look, we are going to raise our game very substantially, but we're not going to be undercut. Fascinating that they should put that in, and obviously the European Union is thinking about that too. 10 years ago, the overwhelming bulk of the best economists in the world would have been radically opposed to carbon border adjustments, and so too with traders, so too would the World Trade Organization. Remarkable to see how that has shifted. And it's shifted largely because politically it's important to bring your businesses and your citizens on board. And it is important to mention the point. I thought Bill's point was really interesting about, we need to get out of the way, which is true because there's so much dynamism. What governments have to do is create a level playing field. Now, what some people think is a level playing field means nothing, means doing nothing. But actually, if people are allowed to pollute, and it hurts other people and they don't have to pay for it, that is not a level playing field. If people are allowed to congest the roads, which hurts other people, and they don't have to pay for it, that's not a level playing field. And this is where the sort of the right and left need just to go back to school and read what Professor Pigou wrote in his famous Economics of Welfare in 1923. We learned then that actually good government policy is precisely to internalize those externalities. And so whether it is a clean energy standard, as I think Mr. Biden is pushing, or whether it's a carbon price, this country obviously has a bit of a problem with carbon taxes and cap and trade. Most countries don't have that. Europe actually doesn't have that problem. It's not a right or a left issue. This morning we heard Boris Johnson, the conservative head of the United Kingdom, talk about a 68% reduction and a 78% reduction by 2035, and a strong endorsement of prices on carbon. So it's not a right or left thing, but just for historical reasons, it's difficult in this country, and therefore a clean energy standard is sort of an alternative.
So, President Grimson, I want to come to you, and from you, I'm going to go back to Pat, because I think this issue of the transition and the equitability, and I know Pat at EI, you spearheaded the idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So let's start with President Grimson first. How do we make sure that all of these instruments that have been put in place, that when they're put in place, they will be just and equitable, so that there's no what I call backlash on net zero. Because if this doesn't work, I can guarantee you the wild card could be public resistance to all of this because it hasn't been equitable enough. So how do we make sure it's equitable from your perspective? And then Pat, coming to you, how do we make sure it's diverse and equitable? So President Grimsby, you first.
Well, it all depends whom you are talking about. And while I agree, we should definitely celebrate the statements that are coming out today and tomorrow from a diverse gathering of leaders. And we celebrate the technological progress that has been made and the corporate leadership that has been exercised by many leading companies. There is a certain tendency for us in Europe and the United States to be too US European centric in our discussion and policy making in this area. So let me throw at you a few wake up statistics, which are very rarely dealt with in this discussion. If we look at the demand for energy, almost half of the demand for energy is for heating and cooling cities. A quarter is for the entire transport sector, cars, aeroplanes, ships. And a quarter approximately is for the industrial production. So even if every car in the world became electric, yeah, it would help, but it would no way get us to the solution. This battle will be won or lost in how we heat and cool cities in the 21st century. The second set of statistics is in 30 years' time. And many people think that's a long time. And then I remind them I was president for 20 years. And for me, that was like a short time. I know there were many people in my country who thought that was far too long. But 30 years is only 10 years longer than I was president. Only 10 years longer. That is how close the next 30 years target is 2050 to us. In 2050, 2/3 of humankind will live in cities. We live in cities, 2/3. And the question of how these cities will be cooled or heated will be crucial. The third set of statistics is that in 30 years' time, half of the global population will live in Asia. A quarter will live in Africa. 3/4 of the global population will live in Asia and Africa, where 2/3 of that population will be in cities. So whether we lose or win in this climate challenge will primarily depend on whether we can galvanize the Asian and the African leadership to fundamentally transform how the cities in Africa and Asia are either heated or cooled. One of the reasons why the Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others now have these aggressive clean energy targets, and they are very aggressive, is that Saudi Arabia has discovered that if they don't become active in renewable energy, by 2050, they will have to become a net importer of energy. Because the air conditioning alone in the UAE and Saudi Arabia takes up to a half of their energy production. So if we want to be realistic and not just live in the cuckoo land that if everybody gets a Tesla, we will all be saved. We need to move this debate from the Euro-American centric way, and we have all been guilty of it. I have for years. And engage with Asia and Africa, where 3/4 of the people of the world will live, in fundamentally transforming the energy system of their cities. That is where the core battle is going to be.
So before we move to finance, Pat, I just want you to chime in a little bit here on the inclusivity of the transition. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because we don't hear much talk about it, but it also has to be inclusive and diverse. How do we do that?
Well, I think that is already happening, because the beauty of clean energy, and I have seen many examples of that through my responsibility as the chair of the Dury and the Zayed Future Energy Prize and Sustainability Prize. We see all over Asia and Africa, we see clean energy initiative of poor communities, which suddenly bring lights into their homes and their villages and so on. And the renewable energy revolution is very inclusive in the sense that the initiative taken even by the poorest of the poor in these parts of the world allows them to be a part of the energy transition. Whereas the fossil fuel translation depended on big corporations, whether they were private or state corporations. So the technological nature and the initiative-driven movement, even by people in villages and poor communities, is in fact much more inclusive than any other major transformation that has happened in the world in the last 100 years. But you're absolutely correct. I mean, more needs to be done. But that is why I come back to my emphasis on Africa and Asia.
Yeah. So I just wanted Pat to chime in here. Thank you, President Grimson. But Pat, I wanted you to chime in from your perspective as you view the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. What more do we need to do to make sure the transition is just that?
Well, I think a couple of things, Lawrence. First of all, I applaud President Biden for including in his work that 40% of the spending needs to go and make sure this is a just transition. I can tell you I'm working on 3 groups, the B20, something with the American Academy of Sciences, and a net zero task force. And there is a large a portion of just transition in every one of those groups. I think we need to demand it as part of public policy. For example, in closing our coal plants, there is money in there for the communities that are affected. We're doing a merger agreement with Avangrid, and part of our merger agreement is to electrify poor rural things. But I think what the president said is really important. This decentralization is going to allow those poorer communities to have electricity, and it's going to be clean. And it's not going to be the power plants, the gas plants, and the coal plants are no longer going to be sited in disadvantaged neighborhoods. But I think we need that politicians. We also need tools. For example, in finance, right? There's a lot of green bonds going around. Iberdrola just has one now that's linked to ESG measures, right? So if finance can get those tools that are also linked to just and equitable transitions and diversity, that's going to incent people. I also think as big buyers of clean energy and things with the rare earth minerals, we need to make sure that those come from places that are sustainably mined, because things are going on if minerals were mined in that way in our country, we would be up in arms. And we need to make sure that we demand our suppliers go with those kind of practices. So I have to tell you, Lawrence, I've never been more excited, and I have never learned more about just transition and what has gone on in this country, and I'm sure others, and that this is a perfect chance to bring communities into it. And I think the fact that voices are at the table now, because when you think about it, a lot of these folks have never had a voice at the table. And now on all these groups, we have environmental justice advocates, the president's doing it. So I think we as private companies need to make sure that we model that behavior. We need to work with our finance partners on it and our supply chain partners.
So it's very great to hear so much excitement in the air. I woke up this morning, like I said, my wife and I made breakfast for our daughter. It's her birthday, all excited, and she's all excited. And I just kept myself thinking about how the word excitement has been used around the world in the context of climate change, which is great. So Andrew, I want to go to philanthropy quickly, and I'll come back to finance. But in fact, I'm going to start with Bill. Bill, so the Prince just mentioned that you are on 2 of his task force.
Yes.
Working on this sustainable markets initiative. And he's doing a lot of work in exercising his leadership here. Could you briefly just say a few words about 1 or 2 of those task forces? And then I want to come back to Andrew to talk about philanthropy.
Well, I'm working on two of them. In many respects, what the Prince is doing is modeled on Fred Terman. Fred Terman is viewed by many people to be is the person that drove Silicon Valley more than anyone else. He was the provost of Stanford from 1955 to 65. And even though he was an engineer that helped create radar, his role in Silicon Valley was not that of an inventor. And even though many of his students like Hewlett and Packard founded some of the biggest companies in the universe, Terman was not a business person. At his very core, he was a convener. And he convened the private sector, not government, the private sector to help create Silicon Valley. Now, His Royal Highness is doing the same thing with his Sustainable Markets Initiative with the climate. And, so like Terman, using the Stanford platform, His Royal Highness is using this Sustainable Markets Initiative platform. And in connection with that, I'm working on task forces to help everyone focus on putting steel in the ground, because we can all talk until we're blue in the face, but putting steel in the ground and convening people to put steel in the ground is what it's all about. And, we'd love to engage with each one of you here on the panel and each one of you in the audience to figure out how we can help you put steel in the ground. It's a big job. And this is sort of what I meant about, getting out of the way. I do agree totally on the externality point. Government is there to keep people on the road, but it's not there to enable to cherry pick one thing or another. And so for His Royal Highness, he is all about doing to the climate world what Fred Terman did for Silicon Valley.
So Andrew, Bill mentioned the word convening. And so how are you going to leverage the portfolio you now have to foster public-private sector collaboration? Pat talked about it to some extent. How are you going to leverage the resources you now have at hand?
Well, look, as everybody has said, Pat and Bill and Soren have said that, it's private finance that will at the end of the day drive it. There are now $70 trillion of assets under management that are committed to net zero. And just yesterday, 28 trillion of that was announced by banks, a new net zero banking commitment. So this is an amazing thing. I mean, a massive revolution in finance. And the question is why? Well, we could discuss that. It's to do with the revolution of understanding about the economics of climate change. We used to believe it was a trade-off, nice to do something on climate change, but it would cost jobs, it would cost competitiveness, and so on. We now know that that's the economics of the last century. The economics of today is actually smart, has to be smart. Climate action leads to more efficiency, drives new technologies, and lowers risks. Those three things lead exactly, as President Biden was saying this morning, to more and better jobs, etc. So where does philanthropy come in? Obviously, it's a small part of the much bigger pot. But nonetheless, it's a jigsaw puzzle. And the private sector needs, obviously, to invest in things that have a rate of return. And some things are at an early stage. Other things require a coalition. We need to make markets, so to speak. Why is what's causing deforestation in Southeast Asia? 2 words: palm oil. Can an individual corporation like Unilever or Walmart solve it on its own? No. Can the government of Indonesia solve it on its own? Absolutely not. Can traders in palm oil in Singapore solve it? No, they can't. You need a whole bunch of conveners and players. So, for example, we need satellite systems that can actually monitor exactly down to 1/10 of a hectare what's happening every single week on the ground. The World Resources Institute, which I was president of until a week ago, has that system. That needs to be financed by philanthropy or by donors. And so what we have to do, as we look at the revolutions that are needed in this coming decade, and they range from getting rid of the internal combustion engine to halving food loss and waste and inventing the hydrogen economy, etc., all the things that the private sector will drive, in each of those areas, there may well be a nudge, a coalition building, the need for some grant finance, and that's what the business will be in. But I've only been on the job for 5 days now, Lawrence, so don't think I'm very wise on this subject.
Well, Andrew, I can almost guarantee by the time we're done, you might get a call from someone on this call, maybe Pat or maybe Bill, with some ideas on how to do it. Because Pat, this is for you and Soren. How do we unlock all of this private capital? $70 trillion, Andrew said, is out there. How do we unlock it to come and bring the kind of development that we need? First, Soren, to talk about it from a development finance institution perspective, and then Pat, from an infrastructure investment perspective, what you have had to work on in your company. So, Soren, you go first.
Well, I think in many emerging and frontier markets, a lot more can be done to unlock private finance, and there's a menu of innovative policy solutions that are really necessary to get private investment in to scale up electricity supply and other low carbon sectors dramatically. But for policymakers, the rewards of making reforms and putting in the steep effort that are often needed to make reforms, the benefits need to be very compelling. And it's not enough that I think there's now a clear signal that there's a willingness to provide climate finance, but it also needs to happen. And policymakers need to know that if they do make reforms, the investments will flow and the benefits for the people will be significant. And so it's there's a back and forth there that in many countries is not going as fast as it could or as it should. And I think as development finance institutions, we are there to try and help speed that process up.
Pat, what about you from the private sector side, infrastructure?
Well, Lawrence, as you know, in the United States, the issue is not a lack of money. Utility companies have more money than we need. I think you can incent as opposed to penalize people, like I mentioned, with green bonds and lower cost financing. You're going to do that. I think there is also a role for this green financing to work with the government on research and development. We have to spend a lot more to speed up our research and development on these technologies, like we talked about with the vaccine. Think about how fast the vaccine went, right? Because there was government funding backing that, or whether it's development financing. I think the greatest need for a lot of this financing is in some of the Asia Pacific countries, as the president talked about. And I would say, really focusing on the countries that may not have the access to the financing that we do in the US, and make it cheaper for them to do green financing projects, right? We talk about limiting coal subsidies and limiting that. I'd change the paradigm around and say, offer the carrots in these countries for the clean financing. And there may be a role for government to back some of these institutions in those countries. So I think there's a lot of problems, but not all problems. So
interesting. You mentioned COVID in collaboration on an international level. Bill, I want to come to you and talk very briefly about R&D. I know Pat has been involved with EPRI as well, and I know Andrew has a love for R&D from different perspectives. But people say we have all the technology for net zero, to get us to net zero. Some say we do, some say we don't. What say you?
I think we have everything we need. And we learned, for instance, with Net Power, that it took 10 years to take a new technology and make it commercializable. And we started Net Power 10 years ago. And as a result, though, you saw last week, we've announced new Net Power plants and many more in the pipeline. But that took 10 years to happen. I actually believe that the change that we need is to stick with red, yellow, green, blue Legos and put those together in ways, do this Amazon thing, break down the silos, have one piece of equipment producing multiple earning streams. We are structured only to have power companies and only chemical companies, only oil and gas companies, only manufacturing companies. We need to Amazonize our climate focus. And if we do that, we can take the red, yellow, green, blue Legos and put them together. We can get hydrogen at 57 cents a kilo. We can get ammonia below $100 a ton. We can get direct air capture at a profit. We can get biomass-driven carbon dioxide removal at $32 a ton. That's by using existing Legos.
I like that. We should Amazonize. That's a word that you're going to hear a lot of people tweeting about pretty soon here. So you mentioned that. I just want to spend one more minute on this issue of finance, and that is the point around how do we measure sustainable finance? What KPI should we be using? Because all of a sudden it's a whole new metric. Soren first, and then I'll go to Andrew. What metrics should we use to measure our progress in terms of investments from a sustainability standpoint? Soren, you're on mute.
Thank you. That's in a way a big regulatory battle right now. So in on the European side, we now have a taxonomy, basically not only venturing to define what is sustainable finance, but also very soon requiring all investors managing other people's money, basically from the smallest to the largest scale, to declare for all their investments whether they're sustainable or not according to this definition. And there are other similar initiatives underway from other regulators in other regions. I think this is creating a massive supply of sustainable finance for Europe and the US, but also for the developing world, and it's already happening. So I think that the question is going to be how quickly can we see assets meeting the demand for this kind of finance.
Andrew, you come from a world where you've advocated strongly for the use of data and measurements. How do we use data and measurement to make sure all of these pledges being made are actually realized in the next 5, 10 years or 20 years?
Well, look, I think this is a huge and exciting intellectual challenge. 15 years ago, different companies, different cities, different countries were announcing greenhouse gas emissions using no commonality of standard. So we set up the greenhouse gas protocols, and it took a lot of time, a lot of agonizing, a lot of meetings with corporates. We now have a standard. We now know how to measure greenhouse gases. We actually don't know yet fully how to measure sustainable finance. And as Soren says, the European Union has taken the best first cut at it. I think it's good. Some people think it's not very good. They need to get together. They need to argue. What we shouldn't do is get depressed, as some people are, saying, oh, it's so complicated. Well, it took 30 years to develop the system of national accounts. Simon Kuznets got his Nobel Prize for that process. It was incredibly messy with massive debates. Well, now we know what the system of national accounts are. It's very detailed. You might not like it, but at least there are standards there that we can, and we need to move in that direction. So this is actually very exciting. The risks are huge. All of these commitments to net zero, very, very exciting. But my goodness me, most of those that are making commitments don't yet fully understand what net zero means. And they do not yet have a path where they backcast from 2050 back to the present. And then they need to set what are called science-based targets. The Science-Based Targets Initiative is an initiative of 4 institutions, the WWF, CDP, UN Global Compact, and the World Resources Institute. It's now, setting those standards, and companies need to buy into them, but they're still far from perfect, and so we're on a journey.
Well, if I may just enter this discussion, because I think we have to realize that the global financial system was not built for this purpose. The global financial system that we have operated in previous decades was built after the Second World War to meet the particular needs and also the geopolitical realities that came out of the Second World War. So I believe fundamentally that we need huge global financial reforms and institutional changes if we are going to achieve this in the time we have. Because the scary fact is that although there's a lot of positive news, we are gradually running out of time, as we all know. And this brings us back to your point about geopolitics and finance, because I don't think we can create the global financial system necessary to facilitate this change unless it brings in an active cooperation between the United States, Europe, China, Asia, Africa, and also Russia. And the fundamental political question, as I see it, that the Biden administration faces, to put it bluntly, is that while I understand all the criticism of China and Russia, The fact of the matter is that Roosevelt and Churchill had to create an alliance with Stalin in order to defeat Hitler's Germany. That was a reality that they had to face. So I think the question we have to answer, including the Biden administration, if we are serious about the threat of the climate, if we are serious, the time is running out, if we accept what John Kerry is actually saying, I don't think it is achievable unless we get a temporary rapprochement between the US, Europe on one hand, and China, Russia, and other countries on the other. So if Roosevelt and Churchill, in the name of defeating Nazi Germany, created a temporary alliance with Stalin and the Soviet Union, don't we also need to argue for a climate alliance with those countries in the next 10 or 20 years, despite the conflicts over Ukraine, Syria, and sort of all the rest? And that is, I think, the financial, political challenge that we have to put on the table. And we must not be scared of actually discussing that.
And I think so. I appreciate that, President Grimson. I think we have to certainly think how we can do both to some extent, change the system, but still not wait for the system to change before we deploy the technology to bring up a net zero. We started a bit late, so we run a little bit over. I know Pat has to leave by 12:30, so we're going to try to get her a few more questions before she leaves. But Pat, can you just clarify something here? So, when you said the utilities have a lot of money, sometimes people misunderstand what that actually means. So can you just sort of, for clarity, expand what you meant when you made that statement?
Yeah, thanks, Loris. My point is, utility in the United States has access to the debt and the equity markets when we want to build infrastructure. We're considered a good investment, a good credit record, so we can borrow money easily or raise equity easily. That's not true in all parts of the world. Exactly. So what I was saying here in the United States, well, this clean financing is great and lower rates, we would take that because we can pass that on to our customers. The need for financing is greater in many other parts of the world than it is here in the US.
And so I think your point, Pat, was accessibility was much easier in the US. And just before we move over to the last two lines, and I know Pat will have to leave us, but we'll carry on for another 10 minutes. Sorry, that whole point about accessibility, how do we make sure that the cost of capital, because Bill wants to sell his technology to developing countries, and those countries have high interest rates to pay. Andrew wants to take his ideas to those countries, and they face the issue of high interest rates, high cost of capital. What has been done by the financial sector, the multilateral banks, to help reduce that burden on those developing countries?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think Pat's point is very important too. Like, I do think this transition is going to be financed primarily by private finance. But I think if we look back over the last decade in developing countries, a large proportion of the increase in electricity supply has been financed, at least in great part, by public finance from different parts of the world. And I don't think we'll see that in the next decade if we see how the economies are at the moment. So the question really is, how can you make private finance at rates that are accessible and realistic to provide acceptable priced power and transport and so on? And that to me, it's really about how many investors you can bring to the table, and development banks definitely can play a role to bring investors to the table by working with governments to reduce the general risk of investing, by improving regulations, improving infrastructure, and so on. I also think development finance institutions like the one I work with can play a very important role to signal to the market, to be first movers as technologies improve, as new regulations come into place, to signal the effects, the positive effects of risk return from the point of view of an investor, and to share the data with private investors so that they can come in with more of a track record and they can price their offering accordingly. And this can really help. Ultimately, we need capital markets, not just investors that are willing to own the projects directly, but capital markets, bond issuance, and so on, equity issuance. to be active also in more developing countries. There are some developing countries where you're seeing green bond issuance and so on, but we need much more of that in more markets for the speed to be what we need it to be.
Good. So I was going to end on a segment called Big Prediction. I'm going to flip it a little bit because I do want to get Pat's big prediction before she leaves, and then we'll come back, the rest of us, and talk about changing values, norms, and behaviors. So we'll end on the value, norms, and behavior question. But let's do the prediction round so that Pat may have to drop off. And we're going to begin with you, Pat. First question. So you've heard a lot about the transition. What do you think needs more attention that is not receiving the attention? The first question. And then the second question is, do you think the world will meet the net zero target by 2050? So first, what are we not paying attention to that we should be paying attention to? And then second, will we meet the target by 2050?
You know, Lawrence, I have to leave for a meeting, but I was hoping I'd get out of the wild card round, really. So, so I think the one part that we need as business and policymakers to give more attention to is the general population. At the end of the day, it is their behavior that is very, very powerful. We're voters, we elect politicians, we make choices every day with what we consume, what we don't consume. And I think we have a huge opportunity to continue to engage people to continue this movement. And if we forget them and think it's all top down, I think we have a problem. So yeah, 2020, none of us forecast 2020, but I think that shouldn't stop us from having big goals. And I do think 2050 is achievable. I think we have it in our power as a globe to make it happen. And the only way it's not going to happen is if we as leaders fail. And I'm confident, knowing all the leaders, that we will not.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. So you're off the hook now for the changing values portion. You can get up when you want, but stay with us as long as you can. Bill, what's your big prediction on what are we missing from a technology standpoint? Is this something we're not looking at? And then also net zero 2050, is it achievable?
I don't think we are missing anything from a technology standpoint. I do think we're missing something from a policy standpoint. And as you heard me say earlier, I do believe that we do need to break down silos. This means that the PUCs need to give the utilities a lot more flexibility than they currently have. This means that we need to find ways of putting a lot of this stuff together. At the same time, the bigger governments need to focus on externalities and pricing externalities rather than picking technologies. We need to focus on the real problem, not someone's flavor of how to fix it. Mm-hmm. And as far as whether we meet 2050, listen, my nature is that I like to solve problems that no one else thinks that can be solved. So therefore, I think we get to 2050, and I think we get there really by economics. I think my dream of 2050 is that the antitrust regulators will be the regulation that people will worry about because we have been so successful.
Okay, that's a good one. I like that. So Soren, what's your thoughts on the missing thing here and also the achievability of the net zero goal?
Well, I very much agree. I think the goal is achievable, as Bill says, because the technology is there, and I believe the technology will not just be. I mean, the bricks may have the colors they have now, but they're going to be. There's going to be a lot of just ongoing technology innovation with the scale up that we will see. So I'm quite confident about that. I think the finance is there, but it's about making it all play together. My big concern here is that the green transition will deepen rifts between different parts of the world, and we have in Africa for especially a very large population that does not have modern energy services, and we know now just how crucial electricity and modern energy services are to the development of your life and your income. And I think there's some very promising technologies for electrification also beyond the grid. They can be attractive investments, but they're going to be in the part of the market that is not large scale, is more complicated, needs a big extra notch. And for me, I think that's one of the areas we need to focus at to make sure that the transition will be a fair one.
President Grimson, your thoughts. Big picture, what are we missing, and will we achieve the goal?
Well, there are three things. I think we are missing the importance of the boring stuff. We are all fascinated by new technologies and innovation. But as I said before, this battle will be won or lost in how we heat and cool cities. And that is a very mundane, boring business. All the engineering is known, all the technology is known. Nobody gets a Nobel Prize out of heating and cooling cities. But this is really the boring stuff we need to concentrate on. And we have to communicate that unless we concentrate on the mundane, boring transformation where it really is needed, we are not going to succeed. My second thing is that without what I call a climate alliance, we have the NATO alliance. We need a climate alliance for the next 10 or 20 years between US, Europe, China, and India, plus the rest of the world. But these four players, US, Europe, India, China, they're really the key. And we should start talking about politically how, despite the conflicts over other things, because of the threat that we all face, there is a huge justification for such a temporary 10 or 20 years climate alliance between the major economic players. But don't let's forget that China and India will, in 30 years' time, have over 3 billion people. 3 billion people, just these two countries. My third point is, which we have not done in this discussion, we need to bring the ice into the discussion, the glaciers and the ice. As I often say in the United States, the ice is neither a Republican or a Democrat. It simply melts. It melts in Greenland, rising sea levels all over the world. It melts in the Arctic Ocean, creating extreme weathers in the United States and also in China and Asia. And the glaciers in the Himalayas are fast melting, and they are a disastrous threat to the economies of Asia, as well as the political military conflict between China, Pakistan, and India. So these are the three things that I would put on the table.
Andrew, what about you? Big picture, what are we missing, and are we going to hit the goal?
Well, two things we're missing. I agree very much with Soren and President Grimson. We're missing a real attention to the developing world. Let's not forget at the moment, United States, we are each emitting 17 tons. China is emitting 10 tons per person, this is. European Union, 7.5 tons. India, 2.5. Africa, on average, 1.5 per person. But of course, what's going to happen, as Prime Minister Modi said today, is look, we've got to raise our emissions. Africa is going to raise its emissions. And because of the very large number of people there, we need to act now, because it's much easier to get on a path when you have low emissions rather than to come back down after you've already built in a whole lot of locked in infrastructure. We need to be investing much more in that. Second, we're missing the behavioral change that is required. This decade we focus on, but to some extent, this decade is relatively easy because much of it will come in the form of electricity, which comes into your house or your building you don't even know. So the United Kingdom has reduced its emissions by 40%, whilst its GDP has gone up by 75% since 1990, but the average British citizen isn't even aware of it. What's going to happen now, moving into the 2030s, you're going to have to change behavior, the way you eat, the way you move, the way you manage your waste and so on, the way you consume. That's something that we haven't really given enough thought to yet. And in terms of where we meet it, it's worth remembering that whilst we're so bullish on today, I certainly am, Secretary General Guterres today, he started by saying, look, we are on the verge of a precipice, which is true. We are losing the battle. So let's not be too optimistic. Having said that, I believe we will get to net zero by 2050. I believe that the Paris deal, which has been so harshly criticized for being voluntary, was actually quite brilliant in retrospect. And actually each year that passes, the incentive structure shifts due to costs coming down, citizens demanding, financial sector asking. And so I believe we will get there, but it's going to be very, very difficult.
Good. Well, you mentioned the word values, and so we gotta continue and talk very briefly, because I know we have to leave in about 10 minutes. You said behavioral change. There was a study done in the UK that basically says for the UK to hit its net zero goals, they're going to need significant and substantial change in the behavior of the citizens. And so, as we've had this discussion, and I want to start with Bill first, and then go Bill, Sarah, and President Grimson, and then Andrew. Let's talk about Generation Z, because by the year 2050, the world is going to be led by a whole different generation. And so, what are we doing now to institutionalize in their behavior what is going to be necessary for a world in 2050? Not the world we have today. What should we do to get Generation Z? My daughter, and maybe your daughters or granddaughters, they're the ones going to be running the world, not us. So how do we get them ready to make the sacrifice that has to be made? It's easy to say when you're young, you make the sacrifice. But when you start to get old, you start to have a different value system. Will they come back and behave like us? Or will they behave the way they're expected to behave to save the planet?
Well, Lawrence, as you started asking that question, I thought, oh no, that's a tough question. I do have two daughters, and the most important thing I think we can do for all of these starts with education. People have to understand what the real problem is, because and at the same time, we have to instill behavior. And that is sort of a moral behavior, and that is that we should not demonize things before understanding. We should not speak before we have all the facts. We should put a scientific process in the minds of our kids, because there's one thing that's going to be for sure, and that is the world in 2050 is going to be something we cannot imagine today. You only have to look back to 1998, when at that point the IEA's predecessor put out a report that had some lines in there that said we all recognize that they called it fuel cells at the time, that fuel cells and solar will not have a place in the energy system of the future because they're not scalable. And that was 1998. Some of the brightest minds out there thought that they knew what the future would look like. And the fact is, the future morphs. And so the most important thing we can teach people is education, how to have an open mind and to be flexible and see how it unfolds, because we will not know what 2050 looks like.
Soren, I want you to respond to that, but I also want you to talk about personal sacrifices, right? It's very easy to talk about change when you don't have to sacrifice. And the challenge with the developing world today is they're saying, why should we sacrifice when we didn't cause the damage? Will Generation Z in the year 2050 be prepared to make the sacrifices necessary for the rest of the world to also benefit from this transition?
Well, I think in the developing world, as well as in high income countries, I think the situation is that I think the situation is that sacrifice is very different if it's everybody together changing lifestyles and embracing new solutions to daily needs, to meet daily needs. But if it's very unevenly distributed, it becomes a lot harder. I think the generation you talk about has extremely high aspirations, is extremely globally connected, is aware what a good lifestyle looks like, and I don't think we can expect a success if we expect very uneven levels of change in consumption, very uneven changes in prospects to earn a decent income. And I think that's both in our developed countries and developing countries, that there needs to be greater equality if everybody's going to buy in. Otherwise, there's clearly going to be a backlash, especially if there's inequality and climate is seen as exacerbating that inequality. That's just not going to work, I think.
President Grimson, then we'll go over to Andrew quickly. What's your thoughts in terms of?
With all due respect, I don't think we should formulate this in terms of sacrifices, because I think that's also misleading. The climate action and the clean energy transformation offers enormous opportunities and exciting future. And it should be presented in that way as the road to a good life, to prosperity, to better health. So we need to frame their future in terms of excitement and opportunities. And I often use the example of my own country to illustrate that. During the first decades of my life, Iceland was among the poorest countries in Europe. A poor nation of farmers and fishermen. Over 80% of our energy was imported oil and coal. We have, however, during my lifetime, in fact, just during the little bit and more than half of my life, we have transformed our economy in such a way that we are now ranked among the top countries in the world in terms of prosperity, welfare, long health, equality, economic opportunity, and so on. And we couldn't have done it without the clean energy transformation. Now, 100% of Icelandic electricity is clean energy. Our house heating is clean energy. We have aluminum smelters in Iceland and data centers from other countries because of the clean energy. The whole modern economic transformation, even the IT sector and the advanced food production sector, is based on the clean energy transformation. And you can see other such examples in different parts of the world, as well as in cities and regions. So we, instead of making young people depressed about their future, we need to explain the huge, exciting opportunities that they have if we map this out in the correct way.
All right. So I digress, and I will move forward. Henceforth, President Grimson, I'm going to talk about the opportunities, not the sacrifices. So, Andrew, how do we make sure that the opportunities accrue equally across the world, to the developing world as well as the developed world?
Well, that's exactly right. That is the question, because it does seem like a sacrifice if you're giving up something that you've got used to that actually didn't really make you happier and certainly didn't make you healthier. So if you've got to give up your 3-ton SUV polluting, and that's, maybe that's a sacrifice, but actually it never made you happier. And in fact, the path that we're proposing, as President Grimson says, is actually, it is a healthier and happier future. And one of the reasons I said before, why supporting developing countries is so important right now is precisely because it is much easier to enter a path and not get onto that terrible path dependency where you're on a suboptimal path, but it's too costly to shift to a much better path. Get on that path from the beginning. So think about the urbanization in Africa. I mean, if Africa urbanizes the way that we have, where you build cities for automobiles rather than for people, it's going to be a disaster, and it will seem a sacrifice for them in 2045. And so we need to get in there right at the very beginning. It's worth bearing in mind that the world has now committed $16 trillion to spend on reflating the world economy. Of that 16 trillion, 13.5 trillion is for rich countries, 1 trillion is for poor, low-income countries, which have a higher population. There's something pretty radically suboptimal if you want to get onto that better path. Just one final point. I really agree with Bill about education. The world is going to be radically different. SDG 4, which is the education SDG, is failing very, very badly. The COVID has put it way off course. It was already off course. Very little stimulus money is going into education. It's going into health. It's going into climate change. It's going into social protection, but it is not going into education. It's a massive failure, education at present. And what we need to educate on is not only the flexibility that Bill says so brilliantly is needed, but it's also an international mindset. We need to worry about an anti-globalist. And I'm not talking about trade and investment, although that's important. I'm talking about a sort of nationalistic selfishness that we need to avoid. And we need to use social media, which enables communication, also to encourage really a sort of moral a globalism on the part of the next generation and ourselves.
Well, listen, I am so delighted to have been able to bring you all together. I'm being told by Vanessa and the production team that I have run over by 5 minutes, but I've asked them to give me a few more minutes because I want to end by asking each of you to take 20 seconds and just give a nice shout out for the earth. If you were to come up with a slogan to sort of encourage us to do more to save the world, what would that be? It could be a single word, it could be a sentence, whatever. But you got 20 seconds each to think about what do you tell us to galvanize our thinking to make this world a better place. So while you think, let me just take this opportunity to say to my lovely daughter who is not watching this because she should be in school, I'll say happy birthday, because her birth and the exercise of her being born, when I saw my wife go through that, made me more committed to Earth Day. So now that I've used that opportunity to give you all time to think, let's start with President Grimson. One word or a very short jingle to help us galvanize support for the world.
Well, some people say people like me have been in the propaganda business most of our lives, in the good sense of that word. So it's quite a challenge to create a slogan, but it should be very optimistic. So I would say a healthy, sustainable, clean energy planet is the key to your successful future.
Thank you so much. Soren, what's your little jingle for the world?
Well, imagine that we reach net zero in the next 30 years. It will be an incredible achievement, and it won't be forgotten for a very, very long time.
Okay, Bill, what's your little thing for the world?
The most obvious transformations in the world look obvious in retrospect and come from the most unusual places. How are you going to transform the world?
So now, Andrew, you get to end it with the nice word we're going to remember. And so, what is it from you?
Earth Day 1970 changed environmentalism in America. Earth Day 2021 is a massive tipping point heading us in the right direction.
Well, gentlemen, and I will say in her absentia, Pat, thank you all for this. I really appreciate it. I think the audience have gotten a lot out of this. Lots of questions. Thanks again. I wish you all a very wonderful Earth Day, and I hope to see you all soon. Thanks again, and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thank you, Lawrence.
Thanks very much.
Happy
Bye-bye.
birthday to your daughter.
Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our panelists for participating in this special Earth Day session. We all know policy and finance will be critical as we continue working towards the energy systems of 2050. And I think we all really enjoyed hearing your Earth Day messages for the planet.